Hello, I'm Julia Fisher, and you're listening to The Olive Tree, the programme that brings you the voices of the believers, both Jews and Arabs, living in Israel and the Palestinian areas today, to find out what God is doing in the region, despite the politics. Today my guest is David Loden, who, with his wife Lisa, moved to Israel from the United States in 1974 after becoming believers. By 1976, they'd started a Messianic Jewish congregation called Beit Asaph, one of the earliest congregations in Israel. David is also a professional musician, and for years it was his passion to see Handel's Messiah performed to an Israeli audience in Hebrew, something that had never been done before. As you are about to hear, this year saw the realization of his dream.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Ki Adonai Tzvaot Malkeinu. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Ki Adonai Tzvaot Malkeinu. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
You will, of course, recognize the music, but did you notice that the words were in Hebrew? So let's hear from the man responsible for arranging the translation and production of Handel's Messiah into Hebrew in Israel, David Loden. When we met recently in Netanya, David started by describing how music has always been an important part of his life.
That's very true. I began to write music basically when I was 8 or 9 years old, I think. I conducted a choir when I was 14 and began to sing, actually, in a professional choir at age 17, and then sang opera. And it's gone on from there to a career in show business before the Lord entered my life.
That's a very, very neat way for me to ask, well, what were you doing at that time? Because actually you were a hippie in the States for a long time, weren't you?
Yes. First of all, I was in the theater, of course, in music and singing opera and singing Broadway musicals and stage managing in New York City for a very large ballet company. And then through some overuse of hallucinogenic substances, I figured it was probably better for me to leave my position in the theater before I got actually thrown out. So I went out and lived in the woods, and I went out and met this wonderful lady who is my wife now, who was living alone in the woods at that time. And we were in a hippie lifestyle, yes.
You were dramatically saved, actually, in the States.
Yes, it was amazing the way in which the Lord brought us to faith. There were several things which led to our accepting the Lord. One, and probably the most important thing, was the fact that there was a person who entered our lives, and he was a Christian in deeds and not just in words. Certainly I had heard the gospel many times before, but I had never seen it lived in the manner in which this man lived it. This man was a man who really loved us. We were not very lovable at the time, but he loved us and supported us and gave me work. He was the manager of a mill making wood products out in the middle of the woods. And he didn't preach the gospel to me, but he lived it, and to the point where I actually had to set him down one day and say, "What makes you different than everybody else?" Of course, he was just waiting for that question. And he shared with me his own testimony, so I started to ask questions, maybe a million. And he answered them all, prayed with us, and so forth, and finally I had no more questions left.
You came to Israel, settled here in Netanya, and of course in those days there were very few believers here. But as we mentioned at the beginning of the programme, music has always been a very, very important part of your life, and it wasn't long before you were forming choirs in a very reconciliatory spirit.
Yes, basically, when we came to Israel, we had very little clue as to what it would be like. We'd never been here before. And we only knew that we were to start some sort of fellowship in the city of Netanya where we lived, and also that we were to write music or produce music for the worshiping community, which was yet in its infancy in the country, of course. So I started to write music at that point, and we did music conferences around and so forth. At some point in the 80s, I took over a choir which we called the Singers of Praise, Amrei Hallel, and we actually did many major works in the country and concerts for probably 4 years or so. This choir consisted of Jewish believers and of Arab believers, and also folks from the nations who were singing in it, and a few non-believers as well.
I want to bring the story right up to date, David, because over the past 2 years, a project that you've probably been living with in your mind for many more years, you saw come to fruition. The Messiah was translated into Hebrew, and you have performed it around the country. Tell me about it.
Yes, I would love to say that the Messiah in Hebrew was my dream, but it really wasn't. The choir was my dream. But there is a wonderful woman, Irene Levy, in Jerusalem, who for many years used to sing with me in the original Singers of Praise choir. For many, many years, she thought the Messiah must be done in Hebrew, and she held that in her heart for probably 30 years. And finally wore out the defenses of a couple of people who really took it upon themselves to do the translation work. Amikam Tavor was one of them, and Aryeh Bar David did a very large amount of the work. And then he produced it, Aryeh, as a small pilot project, maybe 3 years ago now. From that point, it entered my heart that we needed to do it on a much better scale. So I've taken it over from that position, and we have now performed the Messiah in Hebrew in 2 seasons.
So you trained up a choir?
Yes, trained up a choir. We've used the Israel Chamber Orchestra. It's a very well-known orchestra in the country, with first-class crew of soloists. Not necessarily believers, but people that we handpick for these particular roles. And it's been a tremendous, tremendous experience, particularly for the Israelis who so much love that kind of music and love the Messiah. Religious Jews and non-religious Jews, they come to see them actually hear it and understand the import of the words is really incredible.
So just describe to me the first major performance. You know, there you are, you're in the hall in Jerusalem probably, it's packed with people. What did it feel like?
Well, the first performance actually was in Haifa, but it was incredible when we actually put it together because we never knew until the end whether we were going to be applauded or stoned, basically. But in the end, it was amazing to see the reactions of the non-believers sitting in the audience. Of course, the believing community came out to see it, but the vision of the Amutah the nonprofit organization that we have formed here to do this production is to bring the Word of God and to bring liturgical works or works about the Messiah in an understandable manner to the non-believing Israeli audience, and to see their reactions in this was amazing. In the first production, I sang the bass. I didn't conduct it. I sang the bass role. Next to me was sitting the tenor, a very well-known tenor in Israel, and he's not a believer. And afterwards he said, I watched my mother sitting out there. She was weeping, to hear and understand these words, because it's such an incredible presentation of the gospel from the prophets right through the New Testament.
It's such an inspired idea because, of course, Israelis love good music.
That's exactly the point. But the thing about doing it in their own language is that it all of a sudden jumps out of the art box and becomes communication. And that's what we've seen across the board as we've done this project. So we are very encouraged, and I like to say, to those who ask about it, I say, well, listen, if you could take an audience, mostly non-believers, put them in a room and give them the gospel from A until Z, with all of the ramifications of it in a language which they can understand. And afterwards they applaud you, and they've paid for the privilege as well. Would you do that? And so we've been able to do that with the help of God.
You've done it, but you have even more plans. What are you working on at the moment?
We are seeing the realization of a dream of the last couple of years now of seeing the Messiah in Hebrew become a yearly event in Israel. But one event a year is not enough to keep a choir going if you're going to keep a choir alive. So we have another production. We'll be doing 2 larger productions a year, perhaps other things, but the next production we're doing in this year will be what I call an Evening of Gloria, or Erev Glorias, because we are doing 2 settings of the Gloria. One is the Vivaldi Gloria, which is very well known, but we are doing it with a twist. We are doing it in Hebrew, so that those words then will become glory to the Messiah and to the God of Israel will be understandable again. Then we're doing another setting of the Gloria by the British composer John Rutter. And it's a wonderful work, scored for brass instruments and percussion and organ and the choir, and it's wonderful. Since we've already done it once in the evening in Hebrew, we'll be doing that in the original Latin. And then a third work, perhaps an orchestral work or a solo instrument or something like this.
David Loden, a Messianic Jewish believer, a pastor and professional musician. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. You heard David describing how sharing the story of the Messiah with Jewish people through music is a wonderful thing to do. But of course, such major work requires finance. So if you would like to help, you can do this through the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, a small charity based in the UK that supports Jewish and Arab Christians. For more information, articles and books, please visit our website, www.olivetreefund.org, where you can leave a donation. And if you'd like to receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either email inquiries@olivetreefund.org or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.